November 7th, 1942, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Lieutenant Colonel John Waters watched German Panzergrenadiers move with mechanical precision through the valley below. His hands, still soft from stateside desk work 6 months prior, gripped binoculars that revealed a terrible truth. These weren't soldiers. They were professionals who'd been perfecting their craft since 1939. His own men, kids from Iowa and Texas who'd held rifles for the first time 8 weeks ago, were about to face them. The German attack came with textbook efficiency, combined arms coordination that American training manuals described but his troops had never practiced. Within 90 minutes, the 2nd Battalion, 1st Armored Regiment, ceased to exist as a fighting force. 600 American soldiers, average age 22, average time in uniform 4 months, were killed, wounded, or captured. German casualties numbered 47. Oberst Rudolf Lang, commanding the attacking force, wrote in his after-action report a single dismissive line that would echo through Wehrmacht ranks for months. Enemy showed courage but demonstrated kindergarten-level tactical understanding. These are not soldiers but armed civilians in uniform. He was right, and that assessment would prove to be Germany's greatest miscalculation of the entire war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German military tradition stretched back centuries, a professional warrior culture that had survived the Treaty of Versailles restrictions and emerged stronger through circumvention. When Adolf Hitler openly renounced the treaty in 1935 and began massive rearmament, Germany didn't start from zero. They possessed something America lacked entirely, an institutional memory of military excellence, spanning generations. At the Kriegsakademie in Berlin, officer candidates studied campaigns from Frederick the Great through the Great War. The curriculum assumed students arrived with basic military knowledge absorbed from childhood in a militarized society. Young German officers grew up in a culture where military service was expected, honored, and socially mandatory for advancement. Heinz Guderian, architect of Blitzkrieg doctrine, came from a family with military service dating to the 18th century. Erwin Rommel's father and grandfather were officers. Gerd von Rundstedt could trace military ancestors back 11 generations. This wasn't just tradition but identity, woven into the fabric of German society in ways America had deliberately rejected since its founding. The German General Staff system, developed over a century, created officers who thought institutionally rather than individually. A German lieutenant making a tactical decision in Russia drew upon doctrine refined through the Franco-Prussian War, the Great War, and the Spanish Civil War, where Germany had secretly tested tactics and equipment. Every German combat unit had officers and non-commissioned officers who'd fought in Poland, France, the Low Countries, and were now hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. The 47th Panzer Corps, attacking at Kasserine, averaged 4 years combat experience per enlisted man, 6 years for NCOs, 8 for officers. By contrast, American forces in North Africa averaged 6 months in uniform total, 0 months in combat. The American military tradition was fundamentally different, rooted in the citizen-soldier concept, where military service was temporary duty performed reluctantly before returning to civilian life. The Standing Army America maintained in 1939 numbered 174,000 men, ranking 18th in the world, behind Romania. These weren't professional soldiers in the German sense, but career military men, managing a skeleton force designed to expand in emergency. Camp Shelby, Mississippi, in 1940, had facilities for 15,000 trainees, but only 300 regular Army instructors. Fort Benning, Georgia, the infantry school, graduated 200 officers annually, adequate for peacetime but catastrophically insufficient for war. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, the Wehrmacht fielded 3.7 million trained soldiers, backed by another 4 million trained reserves, who'd completed mandatory service. When America entered the war on December 7th, 1941, the United States Army numbered 1.6 million, most inducted within the previous 18 months, with perhaps 50,000 having any combat experience, and that from the Great War 23 years earlier. The German military didn't just have more experience. They had a system for creating, preserving, and transmitting tactical excellence that America lacked entirely. German military training began in childhood through Hitler Youth, where boys as young as 10 learned basic military skills disguised as sports and camping. Marksmanship, map reading, physical fitness, and small unit tactics were taught before conscription age. When German males turned 18 and entered mandatory military service, they arrived with foundational knowledge that American recruits wouldn't receive until basic training. The German conscription system inducted young men for 2 years of active service, followed by years in reserves with regular training. By 1939, Germany could mobilize millions of men who'd completed full military training and remained current through reserve duty. Unteroffizier Hans Becker, captured at Kasserine, had been conscripted in 1936 at age 18, served 2 years in the infantry, participated in the Poland and France campaigns as a reservist, volunteered for Africa Corps duty, and at age 24 had more combat experience than most American battalion commanders facing him. His story wasn't exceptional but typical. The entire German military structure assumed this level of experience as baseline. Training manuals, tactical doctrine, and operational planning all presumed soldiers arrived with years of preparation. When German units received replacements, those men came with months of training and often combat experience from other fronts. The system was designed to maintain quality through depth. America faced the impossible task of creating a mass military from nothing in a society that had deliberately avoided militarization for 150 years. The Selective Service Act, passed September 16, 1940, authorized conscription, but the machinery to implement it barely existed. Local draft boards had to be created. Training facilities had to be built. Equipment had to be manufactured. Most critically, instructors had to be found, and America had almost none. Captain Paul Bauer, assigned to train infantry at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in 1941, embodied the crisis. He'd graduated West Point in 1938, spent 3 years at various posts learning peacetime garrison duties, and had never commanded soldiers in field exercises, let alone combat. In March 1942, he received 280 recruits, average age 20, none of whom had ever fired a rifle. His instructions were to make them combat-ready in 8 weeks. He had 6 other inexperienced officers, 20 NCOs pulled from the peacetime army who'd never seen combat, and a training manual written in 1918 that bore no resemblance to modern warfare. Bauer later wrote, "I was teaching subjects I'd learned from books weeks earlier. The blind leading the blind, except we were sending these men to face German veterans who'd conquered Europe. It was criminal, but it was all we had." The scale of American mobilization was unprecedented in human history. Between December 1941 and August 1945, the United States inducted, trained, equipped, and deployed 16 million service members. To comprehend this number, consider that in 4 years, America put more men under arms than Germany's total population of military-age males. This wasn't just expansion, but creation ex nihilo of a military force without parallel. The logistical challenge exceeded anything previously attempted. In 1940, America had 15 military training bases. By 1943, it had 242. Fort Benning expanded from 15,000 capacity to 70,000. Camp Shelby grew from 300 permanent party to 85,000 trainees cycling through constantly. Fort Hood, Texas, didn't exist in 1940. By 1942, it was the largest armored training center in the world, covering 218,000 acres with facilities, 95,000 soldiers. These weren't just buildings, but complete military cities built in months, requiring roads, water systems, electrical infrastructure, housing, mess halls, hospitals, and training ranges. The construction alone employed hundreds of thousands of civilian workers. The speed was staggering. Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, received authorization in December 1940. The first trainees arrived in January 1941, living in tents while construction continued around them. Training 16 million men required instructors America didn't have. The solution was the cadre system: pull experienced soldiers from operational units to train new recruits, then pull the best recruits to train the next wave. Sergeant James Mitchell entered the Army in June 1941, completed infantry training at Fort Ord, California, was immediately assigned as an assistant instructor, promoted to instructor after 6 months, and by June 1942 was training company commander responsible for 240 recruits, despite never having served in a regular infantry unit. He'd essentially taught himself to be a soldier by teaching others, learning 1 week ahead of his students. This system multiplied inadequacy geometrically. Mitchell's students became instructors who trained more instructors, each generation further removed from actual military expertise. By 1943, American training camps were run by men whose only military knowledge came from other training camps. The institutional incompetence was baked into the system from the start. The training itself revealed the desperate gap between American capability and German excellence. Basic training for American infantry in 1942 lasted 8 weeks, reduced from 13 weeks to process more recruits faster. German infantry training took 6 months minimum. American training focused on individual skills, marksmanship, physical fitness, basic, fieldcraft. German training emphasized unit cohesion, small unit tactics, combined arms coordination. An American private learned to shoot, march, and follow orders. A German soldier learned to function as part of an organic military machine, where every man understood not just his role, but how his role integrated with others. The German squad of 10 men trained together, lived together, fought together as a single organism. The American squad of 12 men were individuals who happened to wear the same uniform. Staff Sergeant Robert Quinn, who survived Kasserine and fought through to Germany, described the difference. German soldiers moved like they'd been born in formation. When they attacked, you couldn't tell where one man's actions ended and another's began. We moved like a football team that just met in the parking lot. Everyone trying hard, but nobody synchronized. It wasn't our fault. We'd had 8 weeks training. They'd had years. Equipment magnified the experience gap, rather than closing it. American industry produced magnificent weapons. The M1 Garand rifle, the Browning machine gun, excellent artillery, but putting advanced equipment in untrained hands created dangerous incompetence. The M1 Garand was the finest infantry rifle of the war, semi-automatic, accurate, reliable. But it required maintenance and understanding that 8-week training couldn't provide. Private Carl Zimmerman arrived in North Africa in January 1943 with a rifle he'd fired exactly 48 times, the qualification course. His unit received no ammunition for training in theatre. When his company made first contact with German forces near Kasserine Pass, Zimmermann's rifle jammed on the third shot. He didn't know how to clear it, had never been taught field maintenance beyond basic cleaning, and spent the firefight hiding behind a rock. He wasn't cowardly, just unprepared, which described 90% of American infantry in early North Africa campaigns. German soldiers carried older bolt-action rifles but knew their weapons intimately, could field strip them blindfolded, diagnose problems by sound, and maintain function in desert sand, Russian mud, or Italian mountains. Superior equipment in amateur hands loses to inferior equipment in professional hands every single time. The leadership gap was even more catastrophic. German junior officers were products of rigorous selection and extensive training. To become a German lieutenant required 18 months of officer candidate school after proving competence as an enlisted soldier. The curriculum covered tactics, strategy, military history, combined arms coordination, logistics, and leadership through intensive practical exercises. A German lieutenant commissioned in 1942 had likely served as enlisted in Poland or France, been selected for officer training based on demonstrated ability, a completed education more thorough than American West Point provided, and arrived at his unit with 2 to 3 years military experience. American officers in 1942 and 1943 came through Officer Candidate School, a 90-day course that took civilians and made them second lieutenants. 90 days from civilian to infantry platoon leader, responsible for 40 men in combat. The assumption was that peacetime leadership skills translated to military command, that college graduates could figure out tactics on the job, that enthusiasm compensated for experience. Second Lieutenant Thomas Andrews graduated OCS at Fort Benning in April 1943, was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division in North Africa in May, and led his platoon in combat in June. His total military experience was 4 months. His opposite number, a German lieutenant in the 15th Panzer Division, averaged 36 months military experience. When they met in combat, experience defeated enthusiasm with mathematical certainty. American non-commissioned officers, at the critical backbone of any army, were even worse prepared. The German NCO Corps was professional, career soldiers who'd spent years mastering their craft. An Unterfeldwebel, equivalent to a sergeant, had minimum 5 years' service, extensive training, and combat experience. American sergeants in 1942 were often whoever showed promise after 8 weeks basic training, given a week of NCO school, and put in charge of other amateurs. Corporal Edward Harris was promoted to sergeant after 12 weeks in uniform because he could read maps better than his peers. 6 weeks later, he was leading a squad in Tunisia against German veterans. As he later said, "I didn't know what I was doing. None of us did. We'd read the field manuals, memorized the formations, but reading about combat and doing combat are completely different things. The Germans knew this. We learned it the hard way." The casualty rates reflected this gap. In the first 3 months of American combat operations in North Africa, November 1942 through January 1943, American forces suffered 23,000 casualties, including 9,000 killed or missing. German forces in the same period, with roughly equivalent numbers, suffered 6,000 casualties, including 1,500 killed. The exchange ratio was nearly 4 to 1 in Germany's favour, and this was before Kasserine Pass. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened with a speed that defied every assumption about military development. Between Kasserine Pass in February 1943 and the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the United States military underwent a metamorphosis that would have seemed impossible to the German officers who dismissed American soldiers as armed civilians. The change wasn't driven by sudden competence or miraculous improvement in training quality. It was driven by something the German military system, for all its excellence, couldn't replicate: the willingness to learn from failure at industrial scale. American commanders didn't make excuses for Kasserine. They studied it, dissected every mistake, and implemented changes across the entire force structure within weeks. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in North Africa, ordered immediate action. Training was extended from 8 weeks to 14 weeks for infantry, 17 weeks for armored units. Realistic combat exercises replaced parade ground drilling. Veterans from Kasserine were pulled from front lines to teach at training camps, bringing actual combat experience to instruction for the first time. The officer candidate school curriculum was completely rewritten based on lessons learned in blood. Most critically, American forces stopped training individuals and started training units. The new training philosophy represented a fundamental shift in American military thinking. At the Desert Training Center in California and Arizona, covering 18,000 square miles of terrain similar to North Africa, entire divisions trained together for months. Tank battalions practiced coordinating with infantry. Artillery learned to support advancing troops. Air liaison officers embedded with ground units to call strikes. Supply units practiced keeping combat formations fed and fueled under realistic conditions. Major General George Patton, who'd witnessed the Kasserine disaster, personally supervised training at the Desert Training Center with fanatical intensity. He demanded 20-hour days, forced marches in desert heat, live fire exercises where artillery landed dangerously close to advancing infantry. Men cursed him, but they learned. Private Daniel Martinez, training in the Mojave Desert in April 1943, wrote home, "We thought basic training was hell. This is something else entirely. Yesterday we marched 30 miles in full gear, got attacked by our own tanks playing enemy, had to dig in while artillery, simulated bombardment, then assaulted a mock German position. 3 guys collapsed from heat. Patton didn't care. He said Germans won't care either. He's right, but I hate him for it." That hatred would save Martinez's life in Sicily 2 months later. The American system's greatest advantage, the one Germany couldn't match, was its ability to identify and promote talent regardless of peacetime credentials. The rigid German class system meant officers came from traditional military families or aristocracy. Talent born in the wrong social class faced barriers no amount of ability could overcome. America's desperate need for leaders created opportunities impossible in peacetime. Audie Murphy, who would become America's most decorated soldier, was rejected by multiple military branches for being underweight. The infantry finally accepted him out of desperation. He stood 5 feet 5 inches, weighed 110 pounds, looked like a child in uniform, and possessed instinctive, tactical brilliance that no amount of training could teach. By war's end, Murphy had killed 240 German soldiers, earned every decoration America offered, including the Medal of Honor, and demonstrated that genius appears in unexpected places when you're desperate enough to look. Staff Sergeant Curtis Culin invented the hedgerow cutter that allowed Sherman tanks to break through Normandy's bocage terrain, solving a problem that had stalled the Allied advance. He was a cab driver from New Jersey with zero engineering background. His invention, improvised from German beach obstacles, was manufactured and distributed to tanks across France within 2 weeks. The German military would have required committee reviews, engineering analysis, and formal approval processes that took months. America was too desperate for such luxuries. The production of junior officers through battlefield promotion created leaders the German system would never have identified. Lieutenant Colonel Matt Urban was a high school teacher from Buffalo, who earned 8 Purple Hearts and the Medal of Honor through sheer stubbornness and tactical innovation. Captain Charles Kelly, a motor transport officer with no combat training, earned the Medal of Honor at Salerno by taking command when infantry officers were killed. Sergeant Jake Lindsay, a farmer from Georgia with 8 weeks training, became Battalion Operations Sergeant for the 2nd Infantry Division because he understood terrain and could read German movements. None of these men would have been officers in the German military. All became leaders because America needed leaders and couldn't afford to care about credentials. The social democracy that seemed like military weakness became strategic strength when competence mattered more than class. By mid-1943, American units were increasingly led by men who'd proven themselves in combat, rather than men who looked good in dress uniforms. The transformation was visible in casualty exchange ratios that shifted dramatically as American experience accumulated. Sicily, July 1943, provided the first evidence that American forces had learned from North Africa's disasters. The 7th Army under Patton moved with coordination that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Infantry and armour worked together. Artillery provided effective support. Supply lines functioned despite chaos. American troops still weren't equal to German veterans man for man, but they no longer fought as individuals. They fought as an army, and that made all the difference. The German Panzer Division, defending against American advance near Gela, faced soldiers who didn't panic under fire, maintained formation under artillery, and adapted to changing situations. Hauptmann Friedrich Lang, commanding a German company, noted in his report, "The Americans have improved dramatically. They still make mistakes, but they learn from them within hours, rather than repeating them indefinitely. Their coordination between arms is now adequate, sometimes good. They are no longer amateurs, but developing professionals." This assessment, from an officer who'd fought in Poland, France, and Russia, marked a turning point. The Germans had noticed. American soldiers were becoming dangerous. The Italian campaign from September 1943 through May 1945 became America's finishing school, a brutal education that transformed raw formations into veteran units through continuous combat. The terrain favoured defence, allowing smaller German forces to inflict heavy casualties, while teaching Americans the cost of every tactical error. Each mountain ridge, each river crossing, each fortified town became a classroom where lessons were learned in blood. The Rapido River crossing in January 1944 killed 1,600 American soldiers in 48 hours through poor planning and coordination failures. The lesson was learned. Future river crossings were meticulously planned, rehearsed, and supported. Monte Cassino's 4 battles from January to May 1944 ground down German defenders through sheer persistence, while teaching Americans that some positions couldn't be taken by courage alone, but required overwhelming firepower and patience. Anzio Beachhead, January to May 1944, where American forces landed behind German lines, only to be contained for 4 months, taught the necessity of aggressive action after successful landings. Every disaster became doctrine. Every failure generated new training. The American military was learning faster than any military in history because it had to. By spring 1944, the force assembling in England for the Normandy invasion bore little resemblance to the amateurs who'd landed in North Africa 18 months earlier. The 1st Infantry Division, bloodied at Kasserine, had fought through Tunisia, Sicily, and now prepared for France with veteran competence. The 4th Infantry Division, training in England since February, included officers and NCOs pulled from Italian combat to leaven inexperienced troops with hard-won knowledge. The 29th Infantry Division, trained with British commandos, learning assault techniques. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions practiced parachute insertions until they could assemble in darkness behind enemy lines. The scale was staggering. 156,000 troops landing on June 6, 1944, supported by 7,000 ships and 12,000 aircraft. But numbers meant nothing without competence, and that competence had been purchased through 2 years of defeats, disasters, and deaths that taught Americans how to fight. D-Day itself demonstrated how far American forces had evolved. At Omaha Beach, where everything went wrong, American soldiers adapted rather than collapsed. Units mixed together into ad hoc formations. Junior officers took command when senior officers died. Small groups worked around obstacles using tactics they'd learned in Italy. By nightfall, despite 2,400 casualties, Americans held the beach and were advancing inland. German defenders, expecting another North Africa where American inexperience could be exploited, instead faced soldiers who wouldn't break. Oberst Fritz Ziegelmann, defending Omaha Beach with the 352nd Infantry Division, reported, "The American soldier has become formidable. He takes casualties that would break other armies and continues advancing. His coordination has improved to match his material superiority. We can no longer count on tactical excellence to overcome numerical disadvantage." That assessment from a German colonel who'd fought since 1939 marked America's arrival as a military power. The amateurs had become professionals through the hardest school imaginable. The Normandy campaign from June to August 1944 saw American forces consistently defeating German units that still possessed superior tactical training and experience. The difference was systematic competence replacing individual excellence. American artillery, coordinated through fire direction centers, could mass fires from multiple battalions within minutes. German artillery, often superior in quality, fought as individual batteries. American air support, controlled by forward air controllers embedded with ground units, provided close support impossible for German forces whose Luftwaffe had been destroyed. American logistics kept units supplied despite distances that would have paralyzed German forces. At Falaise Pocket in August 1944, where 50,000 German soldiers were trapped and destroyed, American forces demonstrated operational competence that matched German capability. The encirclement, the artillery coordination, the infantry armor cooperation all showed that Americans had learned not just tactics but operational art. General Omar Bradley, watching the destruction, commented, "2 years ago, we couldn't have done this. Hell, 6 months ago we couldn't have done this. These soldiers have learned everything the Germans had to teach, and we have resources Germany never dreamed of." The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the final examination. Germany assembled its last reserves, launched surprise offensive through the Ardennes, and initially achieved success through deception and weather that grounded American air power. This was Germany's best. Veteran divisions, new equipment, experienced commanders, fighting on ground they'd chosen against surprised opponents. For 2 weeks, the outcome was uncertain. Then American competence, built through 3 years of defeats and victories, reasserted itself. The 101st Airborne held Bastogne despite being surrounded, buying time for reinforcement. Patton's Third Army turned 90 degrees north and advanced 100 miles in 48 hours through winter weather, a feat of logistics and command that German planners considered impossible. American artillery dominated German movements once weather cleared. Supply lines kept units functioning despite chaos. By January 1945, the Bulge was eliminated, and Germany had lost its last offensive capability. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding the offensive, assessed American performance with professional respect. The American soldier of 1945 is the equal of any soldier in the world. He is well led, well supplied, well trained, and fights with confidence born of experience. Our initial advantage of professional training has been overcome by their willingness to learn. We can no longer count on tactical superiority. They have matched us while retaining overwhelming material advantage. The final battles in Germany from February to May 1945 saw American soldiers who'd travelled an impossible distance from the amateurs of Kasserine Pass. They crossed the Rhine against minimal opposition, advanced against crumbling resistance, and occupied Germany with the casual competence of victorious professionals. The German military, once the world's finest, had been broken not by soldiers who started better, but by soldiers who learned faster. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten, who'd landed at Omaha Beach on June 6th and fought to the Elbe River by April 1945, reflected on the journey. I enlisted in 42, knowing nothing about being a soldier. The army taught me just enough to not die immediately. Combat taught me everything else. By the time we reached Germany, I'd been in uniform 33 months and in combat 22 months. The Germans we captured looked at us like we were supermen. We weren't. We were just Americans who'd survived long enough to learn the job. The human mathematics of American mobilization revealed costs that pure numbers obscured. Of 16 million Americans who served, 405,000 died. That's 2.5% casualty rate, low by historical standards but representing individual tragedies multiplied beyond comprehension. Each death was a letter to parents, a widow left alone, children who'd grow up without fathers. The amateurs who learned to be soldiers paid tuition in blood. Private Edward Slovic, executed for desertion in January 1945, was a replacement soldier sent to combat with minimal training who broke under pressure. His execution, the only American soldier executed for desertion in World War II, represented the system's cruelty toward men asked to do jobs they weren't prepared for. The 80,000 American prisoners of war taken by Germany, disproportionately from early campaigns when training was inadequate, paid the price of America's learning curve. Technical Sergeant John Klein, captured at Kasserine Pass, spent 30 months in German prison camps watching American bombers overhead, knowing his country was winning while he starved. The 61,000 psychiatric casualties, men who broke mentally under combat stress, were products of a system that rushed men into horror they weren't psychologically prepared to face. The comparative costs between German and American systems revealed different philosophies' human prices. Germany's professional military minimized casualties through superior training and tactics, but created a system that couldn't expand or replace losses. By 1945, the Wehrmacht was conscripting 16-year-old boys and 50-year-old men, using soldiers with 6 weeks training to face American veterans. The professional system had consumed itself and resorted to the same amateur desperation Germany had mocked in Americans. America's amateur system created preventable early casualties through inadequate training, but built expansion capacity that Germany couldn't match. The 16 million Americans under arms in 1945 represented depth Germany never possessed. Even accepting higher casualties per engagement, America could lose battles while winning the war through sheer capacity to replace losses and learn from mistakes. The amateur approach, wasteful and inefficient in the short term, proved strategically superior over time because it valued adaptability over initial excellence. The transformation of American soldiers from amateurs to professionals validated democratic society's military potential in ways that terrified totalitarian observers. The Soviet Union, watching American mobilization, saw industrial democracy create military power that matched their own mass conscription system while maintaining economic prosperity. After the war, Soviet military theorists studied American training evolution, seeking to understand how capitalist democracy had produced such effective military force. They concluded that social mobility, which allowed talent to rise regardless of class, created leadership depth that rigid communist hierarchy struggled to match. The lesson contributed to Soviet post-war emphasis on technical education and merit-based advancement, though always constrained by political reliability requirements. China, observing American success, concluded that mass mobilization could defeat technically superior forces if sustained long enough for learning to occur. This observation would influence Chinese military doctrine through the Korean War and beyond. American success in transforming amateurs into professionals became the model that democratic nations followed, while totalitarian states struggled to reconcile their system's rigidity with the flexibility combat demanded. The individual stories behind mobilization statistics revealed the human transformation at scale. Corporal Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector who refused to carry weapons, became a combat medic who earned the Medal Honor at Okinawa by saving 75 wounded soldiers under fire. His journey from religious pacifist to military hero showed how American society's pluralism created strength through diversity. Staff Sergeant Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian who helped raise the flag at Iwo Jima, represented the 65,000 Native Americans who served despite facing discrimination at home. His struggles with fame and alcoholism after the war revealed the costs of turning ordinary citizens into heroes. Captain Charles Lindbergh, famous aviator who'd opposed American entry into the war, volunteered in 1944 as a civilian consultant and flew 50 combat missions. His transformation from isolationist to warrior reflected America's broader shift from reluctant neutrality to committed engagement. These individual journeys, multiplied 16 million times, represented the democratization of military service in ways Germany's professional army could never achieve. The final accounting revealed truths that transcended military analysis. Germany built the world's finest military through centuries of tradition, professional training, and cultural militarization. They lost to amateurs, who became professionals through necessity, pain, and systematic learning. The German military system was optimized for the short war their doctrine assumed possible. When war extended beyond quick victory, their system couldn't adapt or expand. The American system, optimized for nothing because it barely existed, possessed infinite adaptation capacity through trial and error. Germany's strength was its initial excellence. America's strength was its willingness to fail, learn, adapt, and return stronger. By war's end, the amateurs Germany had mocked in 1942 had become the soldiers defeating Germany's survivors in 1945. The transformation took 3 years, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, required mistakes on catastrophic scale, but proved that democratic society could mobilize military power matching or exceeding any totalitarian state. The 16 million Americans who served validated the citizen-soldier concept that professional militaries had dismissed as obsolete. They proved that ordinary people, properly led and sufficiently motivated, could become extraordinary soldiers through experience and determination. In 1975, at a reunion of 2nd Armored Division veterans, former Sergeant Harold Fitzgerald met former Oberst Rudolf Lang, the German officer who'd written the dismissive assessment after Kasserine Pass. Lang had survived the war, spent 3 years as prisoner in American camps, and returned to Germany to rebuild as a civilian. The conversation between them revealed how both understood what had happened. Lang spoke first. "I wrote that you were armed civilians in uniform. I was correct, and I was completely wrong. You were amateurs, but amateurs who learned. We were professionals who couldn't adapt. By 1944, you'd matched our expertise while keeping material advantages we couldn't overcome. The moment you became competent soldiers, we'd lost. Your system allowed for initial failure. Ours didn't. Fitzgerald responded, "You're right. We were terrible soldiers at first. Half of us didn't know which end of the rifle to hold. But we learned. Every mistake taught us something. Every disaster made us better. You started perfect and stayed perfect. But perfect wasn't enough when you were outnumbered and outproduced. We started terrible and became good enough, which was all we needed to be." The reunion concluded with both men acknowledging what their younger selves couldn't have understood, that America's amateur military had defeated Germany's professional army, not despite being amateurs, but because being amateurs meant they could learn without shame, adapt without pride interfering, and improve at speeds no established system could match. The 16 million Americans who served had been civilians in uniform, just as German propaganda claimed. But those civilians learned to be soldiers faster than Germany could train professionals, and that learning curve, purchased with blood and tears, proved sufficient to break the Wehrmacht and liberate Europe. The mathematical proof was written in 16 million training records, 405,000 graves, and one decisive victory that validated democracy's military potential for generations to follow. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.